In Birmingham, I actually had my first experience that made me think that I wanted to be an artist. And I had that experience when I was in kindergarten, even though at the time I couldn't name the profession as an artist, but I knew I wanted to make pictures like some pictures I had seen in a scrapbook that my kindergarten teacher kept in the classroom. And so that was the experience I had then. And I think it's meaningful that I was born where I was born, and the political and social climate of Birmingham, Alabama was the climate that it was, and that we moved to Watson, California, and then I grew up mostly in South Central. And so I went through a period in which I was sort of a witness to the shootouts between the Black Panthers and the LA Police Department from that Central Avenue, and walkouts and rallies and kids setting the school on fire during the Black Student Union movement period. And so it's like, if you keep seeing all those kinds of things, it shapes your perception of the world. And so, and because I had met an artist named Charles White, who did a lot of work that seemed to have had a kind of social, he was committed to some social kind of transformation through the use of his artwork. And he was interested in artists like Katie Kollwitz, and some of the German expressionist artists, whose work was also kind of embedded in a political reality of a time. I started to think, well, that's what artists do. This is when I really started to consider this idea of visibility and invisibility, presence and absence, and a kind of simultaneity of that condition as it relates to Black people. So there are two versions of the story of the Invisible Man. One written by H.G. Wells, in which the character becomes completely transparent and invisible, but the one by Ralph Ellison, in his description of the condition of invisibility as it relates to Black people, is that it's not this sort of retinal kind of invisibility where you can't be seen. It's a psychological invisibility that's imposed by a culture that doesn't particularly care to see you, and certainly doesn't care to see you in the fullness of who you are. And so reading that book, and in particular the prologue to the book, really is what set up this kind of exploration for me, of this sort of simultaneous capacity of being and not being present and absent. The first picture I made that used the image of a Black figure painted in black against the Black background, where you try to figure out a way to create some separation between the image and the ground by changing the color temperature of the two different blacks you would use. So that's really the first time I'd used an image, and it really came out of reading Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. The souvenir paintings were all a part of an exhibition I did at the Renaissance Society in Chicago, and it was really a way of trying to come to terms with this another duality. So when people think about the civil rights movement, they think of the We Shall Overcome, the March on Washington, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. That's what's popular in the minds of most people. In the painting, there's a banner on the wall of that room that has the image of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King Jr., who became, in effect, sort of like a holy trinity of the civil rights era. All three of them assassinated within the 1960s. And so they were martyrs to social progress. But in the frieze across the top, you have images of other people within the Black liberation struggle and the civil rights movement who also died at the same time that the Kennedys and Martin Luther King died. But they didn't get anywhere near the kind of popular commemoration. So in a sense, the souvenir paintings I use them as a kind of an annunciation painting. And it really is a kind of call to remember all these people and their contribution to the period of the 1960s on both sides of the equation, on the nonviolent side of the equation and on the Black liberation side of the equation, that preserved the right to use violence if it was necessary. And that's where Malcolm X's phrase, we want freedom, but how do we want it? By any means necessary. I'm acutely aware of the general absence of black figures in the center of the narrative of any of the pictures that become the foundation of the art history we know. And that's through almost all the periods of art history for the last 500 or 600 years. Now, those foundational images, if we say from the early Renaissance, take Giotto and Piero della Francesca and all those artists, through Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, Raphael, all those artists, all the way up, you keep moving through the history of art. The black figure is not the image that you expect to see when you think about any of that work. There are black people in some of those narratives, and especially in some of the Christian narratives where there's the tradition of the black magi sort of positions one of those kings from the East as a black figure. But that's not the central focus or thrust of the narrative. Neither when you get to 18th and 19th century French painting, and in particular I look at the Rococo and things like that. We're not the center of those subjects. We're usually not the object of desire in those pictures. And so one of the ways you can bring the black figure from the margin to the center in relationship to that art history is to use those classical models as a structure and as a frame and place the black figure in a picture that operates on the same terms that those pictures do. And that suite that's based on the Rococo paintings in this show is actually based specifically on the Fragonard painting, The Swing. It would be one thing to take the Fragonard painting and put a black woman in the swing. Well, that's the sort of simple way of thinking about it. The other way is to kind of to embody the concept of the swing. And the way I did it, there are 5 paintings that constitute the swing. And so you have 2 figures in the picture, a black man lifting a black woman and swinging her around in a 360-degree rotation. That's a swing too. So that's a way of referring back to the Fragonard painting without having to reproduce the Fragonard painting. And then placing the black figure in the center of the picture as a subject. It's one thing to stand by and admire the work of other people. The moment that I recognize the greatness of those things, it is unacceptable for me to not also try to match the sophistication and complexity and the appeal of those works by doing it with images that have people who look like me in them. There are other people who are doing critical analyses of culture and they're writing and they're talking about those things, but you need we live in a material world in which the things we see determine shape our expectations. And that's the thing. So in the art world, if I go back to that model, if I keep going to the museum and only seeing white bodies in pictures when I go to the museum, then I don't expect to see black bodies in the museum, because then I don't think they belong there. But if I make black bodies and those black bodies end up in the museum too, and you come to the museum and I go to the museum, I see black bodies, I see white bodies, I see Asian bodies, I see Latino bodies, then I don't have this, then when I go to the museum, I expect to see those kinds of things every time I go. That matters a lot. David Walker was a free black man living in Boston area, who wrote a pamphlet called David Walker's Appeal to the Colored People of the World, and in particular those of the United States. And it was a critique of the condition of black people in the world at the time as he saw it, and an analysis of and a critique of the hypocrisy of the Declaration of Independence. In a country that claims to be built on the principles of freedom and liberty, but at the same time, the people who were writing that thing were owning slaves and buying and selling people like they were cows and sheep. It's like, well, he said there was something wrong with that. And so in a way, I say the same thing. In a world in which the notion of equality is supposed to be the dominant model and that everybody's supposed to have equal access to an equal capacity, we don't still see a world that has that kind of equality yet, and that everybody is represented at the table or represented in the museum. We don't see a world that's like that yet. And so to the degree that I'm invested in sort of making that equality a reality, you could say that I'm a lot like David Walker.